Hey everyone, in this video we want to do a brief talk on the relationship between sun exposure and melanoma. This is something that we have looked into quite heavily ever since Brianna was diagnosed with melanoma.
Yeah, I was diagnosed last summer with metastatic melanoma. It was through my lymph nodes. It wasn't in the organs yet. I have to keep getting tests to make sure that it doesn't go to the organs.
Yeah, basically she has stage 3 melanoma. So we love being out in the sun. And when we were seeing our dermatologist, she was very adamant that we shouldn't spend a lot of time in the sun because it contributes to melanoma.
And use lots of sunscreen.
Yeah, and so it's a very strongly held conventional viewpoint that sun exposure contributes to melanoma. And when you start digging into the literature around this relationship, it's actually very, very weakly supported. Most evidence doesn't support it. And
isn't most of the evidence like cell cultures?
Yeah.
As far as melanoma, we're not talking about BCC and SCC.
Yeah.
Melanoma specifically.
Yes. So for melanoma specifically, there's a very complex relationship between the sun and the disease. And it's too complex for us to get into in any depth in these short videos.
Yeah. For example, I grew up in LA and I was in the sun all the time. Then I drove a convertible for a decade and my melanoma is on my shin. If it was just sun exposure, it'd be on my face. So there's a lot of moving parts too there.
Yeah, and so the big one that we wanted to touch on in this video is kind of the primary mechanisms believed to be involved and why they just don't pan out when you look at the literature itself. And so the big issue with sun exposure that most of the dermatologists and the conventional viewpoint in general focuses on is the UV radiation component, the ultraviolet light that sunlight puts out. And so this is a potentially carcinogenic light source that is believed to contribute to melanoma in 3 main ways. The first one being that it directly damages skin cells and melanocytes, which can contribute to mutations and the unrestrained growth that causes tumor formation. It causes oxidative stress in the skin, which also contributes to DNA damage and the mutation potential. And it suppresses immune function in the skin that would otherwise destroy any tumors that are beginning to form. So it's through these 3 mechanisms, basically damaging DNA directly and indirectly through oxidative stress, and inhibiting our body's inborn ability to fight off the cancer formation, that UV radiation and through that sunlight is believed to contribute to melanoma. But it really, those 3 mechanisms don't pan out when you look at the research, do they?
No. Concerns over sunlight-induced immunosuppression is misrepresented by most dermatologists and the medical system. We have research dating back to the 1990s that show most healthy adults don't experience immunosuppression with direct UV exposure.
Interesting.
Yeah. Even people who had a history of skin cancer have developed a tolerance towards the UV radiation, and they didn't experience any immunosuppression in subsequent exposures.
Okay, so just to make sure I'm understanding you correctly, basically what you're saying is that most people don't experience UV-induced immunosuppression, but of those that do, the majority of them develop a tolerance later on that prevents further immunosuppression after that initial insult, because it's like their body adapts.
Yes. Okay, so how does it do that? It's a form of hormetic stress. What the heck is that? Huh? Most people don't know what that is. Where a little bit builds up your tolerance to it, right? Like we were saying.
Yeah. So it's like too much is damaging, too little doesn't have any effect, but a small amount of exposure is enough to stimulate your body to grow more resilient over time.
An adaptive response.
Kind of like exercise, right?
Yes,
if you go and train for 5 hours every day on end, then you run yourself into the ground because you can't recover. But if you don't train at all, you never grow your muscles. there's that intermediate amount that provides the hormetic stress that leads to bigger and stronger muscles.
Yep. Yep. I'm going to read a quote from the researchers at University of Buenos Aires that talks about this. Okay. Sunlight exposure cannot be considered only as a carcinogen nowadays. There is also abundant evidence showing that sunlight effects, especially of very low doses, are indeed beneficial, and not only due to the vitamin D synthesis. We believe that plenty of work has yet to be done in the field of photoimmunology, which needs to cover the impact not only of very low doses of radiation, but also of exposure to non-UV light, focusing on the effects of various doses on the immune system. We as immunologists, and particularly photoimmunologists, have to move forward from the milestone of UV-induced immunosuppression towards a more comprehensive analysis of the interaction of human beings with the environment.
Wow. So, University of Buenos Aires is kind of like the head group of researchers that are beginning to discover that these chronic, very low doses of UV exposure bolster the immune system over time. And this helps explain why when you look at outdoor workers that are chronically exposed to the sun, they
have a lower risk of melanoma.
Yep. When you look at the observational,
than indoor workers.
Yeah, when you look at that observational research, meta-analyses of these studies show that the outdoor workers have either a lower risk or no increased risk compared to indoor workers for melanoma. And it's believed to be because your body adapts to this chronic low-dose UV exposure, and that bolsters your immune system.
Yeah, you know what
time.
this reminds me of? The plant people that hate plants because they have antitoxins in them, right? Don't eat them. But it's the same idea.
Yeah,
right?
It's one of the
hormetic stressor.
Yep, that's how xenobiotics from plants, phytochemicals, that's how they work in the liver primarily, is they stress the liver, so it increases its expression of NRF2 and other pathways that, like the antioxidant defense element, all of which provide a more robust detoxification ability.
Yeah, so avoiding all this stuff makes your body weaker.
Yeah.
And more susceptible to diseases. Just like avoiding the sun to prevent melanoma is going to increase your risk of melanoma.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the third point too is the one of generalizability. So UV radiation makes up something like 5% of the light put out by the sun. About half of all sunlight that you're exposed to comes from red and infrared radiation. Okay, and these are very unique sources of light because they are able to penetrate much more deeply into the body. Infrared light in particular has been shown to be a powerful mitochondrial stimulant. And what's interesting about the relationship between the red and infrared light with UV radiation is that red and infrared light has been shown to provide a source of preconditioning to the skin that bolsters its resilience from any damage that would be caused by UV radiation. Now, what I mean by that is that researchers who expose people to red and infrared lights for like 30 minutes and then expose them to UV radiation that should make them burn, it doesn't make them burn. In fact, their skin, they're able to be exposed to almost double the UV radiation they would without this preconditioning from the red and infrared light before they actually start to incur skin damage.
And for those of you that don't know what red and infrared light is, a lot of you watching my stories send me questions about it because you see me sitting in front of my red lights in the morning. I use a Juve light personally.
There's a really good book out there by Ari Whitten called like The Ultimate Guide to Red Light Therapy or something. Definitely, it's the most comprehensive book on this topic that you could find, and completely evidence-based, like the effects of photobiomodulation in red and infrared light, well established in the scientific literature for a lot of things. But sticking here with this relationship with UV radiation, It's kind of interesting to think about this from a natural and evolutionary standpoint, because when the sun rises and when it sets, light has to travel a farther distance over the horizon to get to you, rather than when it's right overhead. And that means most of the UV light gets filtered out. And so when you look at a rising or setting sun, most of that light hitting you is in the red and infrared spectrum, even more than the 50% that you get hit with when it's right overhead. And there's almost no UV radiation. So is it any coincidence that when you look at indigenous societies living in Africa, like the 𝘮𝗪𝘴𝘮𝘮, is it any coincidence that their time of highest sunlight exposure is around 9 a.m. when the sun is rising, and they actually seek shade when it's directly overhead? And is it any coincidence that you get all of this all of this red and infrared light radiation that first preconditions you to the UV radiation you would then get hit with when it's overhead, and then facilitates tissue repair and any DNA and the repair of any DNA damage you did incur when it was overhead while the sun is setting? I mean, maybe it's just a coincidence, but it doesn't seem like it.
Pretty amazing.
Nature's pretty smart. And if the sun was going to give us a very deadly form of skin cancer called melanoma, I don't think we would have made it as far as we did living under it for millions of years.
No, that's insanity.
And yes, I do know that that's partially a fallacy, a naturalistic fallacy. But you can't ignore the evolutionary basis for a lot of things that occur in our lives.
Absolutely.
So yeah, that was our little spiel.
Yeah, we'll cover a lot more in the future on melanoma because, I mean, I'm going through it.
Yeah.
So that's it for today, though. And give us a like, share,
comment,
subscribe.
Yep.
And we'll see you next time.
Bye.